Welcome everybody to the panel on the body. My name is Eleanor Lacane. Our speaker, Catharine MacKinnon, is professor of law at the University of Michigan and a longtime visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. She holds a JD from Yale Law and a PhD in political science from Yale, specializing in sex equality issues in political theory and under international and domestic law. Professor MacKinnon pioneered the legal claim for sexual harassment, and with Andrea Dworkin, created ordinances recognizing pornography as a civil rights violation. Her approaches to equality, pornography, and hate speech have been influential worldwide. She is the most widely cited female legal scholar in the English language. Representing Bosnian women survivors of Serbian genocidal sexual atrocities, in the year 2000, she won with co-counsel a damage award of $745 million, the first recognition of rape as an act of genocide. Please welcome Professor Catharine MacKinnon.
It is so glorious to be here in Iceland, where women matter and where you sing. It's really fabulous, and thank you so much for inviting me, and especially to Halla for organizing me and making it possible for me to be here. So women have voted in Iceland for 100 years, and this alone is worth this big party and a great many more celebrations. You've made your government more yours during this time and brought yourselves as close or closer to political equality than anywhere in the world. Although actually this recent situation with Supreme Court appointments has cast a bit of a shadow on that. But even so, the legal and political environment for the advancement of women in Iceland is among the strongest in the world, far ahead and more promising for real sex equality than anywhere else I have seen. Most places, at best, are about halfway there. Here in Iceland, you could have real equality in your lifetimes. You really are that close. So let's think together about how to use your political equality to create social equality, how to go from women's suffrage to civil rights. How do women make our citizenship count in states that are originally built on our second-class status? So we become, in Gloria Steinem's words, linked, not ranked, toward real parity of social being, in recognition that sex is an equality, but gender, the social meaning of sex, is still a hierarchy on many levels, one that makes political and sexual and physical aggression and violence continue to exist. Specifically, to achieve real social equality, we really need to face the hard question of how we end sexual coercion, both when it is extraordinary and when it is routine and normal. In the recognition that even when it is normalized, it is not natural or inevitable, but a product of the unequal social arrangements that create the sexual politics of male dominance and enforce some kinds of inferiority on women still. To be serious about making this change, one vast engine that drives and normalizes a culture of sexual subjection, is often avoided because it is powerful, rich, organized, criminal, and has many legitimate front groups. Many men in our lives love it, and all this makes its reality hard to talk about. It centers on the body, but is far from limited to it. Speaking of it makes men hostile and aggressive, and it makes women silent. I refer to pornography, a global industry whose products increasingly saturate our cultures, including this one. Because you already know this, how to address it effectively here by law is the challenge I was given by the Icelandic women who invited me here to speak with you today. That something needs to be done about pornography as an institution of sex inequality has been clearly recognized in Iceland in the last several years. You know about the abuse and exploitation of the children and women used to make it. Abuse that is then mass-produced through being imposed on the women and children who are in the lives of the mainly men who consume it. You have documented the 20% of raped women in Iceland who know that their rape involved pornography. You are aware of the research that has only become stronger in the last 35 years on all the women who are seen and treated not as full human equals, but as sexual things, not as political leaders, not as worth a full wage by its consumers. You are already concerned about the distortion of the sexual and personal development of young people by pornography, including girls who come to lack confidence in themselves and self-esteem, who don't value themselves because they are only valued for how they can be sexually used. You care about the damage pornography does to human intimacy. Because you already know all of this, and really there is no honest empirical debate on any of it, and your consultations have produced some real consensus on this harm in this national community, you have seen pornography as a place where sex inequality can no longer be overlooked. Because you see this reality, we don't have to waste our time contending endlessly with the holy trinity of the big lies of the pornographers and their lackeys. What a relief. These three conscious fabrications that control the debate, no amount of evidence or argument dislodges anyway, because they are driven by the profit motive of pimps and the slimy sexual faith of Johns, who are a substantial proportion of any population, including this one. But these lies are, 1, pornography is harmless, 2, pornography is expression, art, literature, whatever, and 3, pornography is freedom, specifically sexual freedom. And you know, Goebbels was right of the Third Reich that big lies are harder to combat than small ones. And yet, these particular lies do hang around, and they mutate like a virus underlying the discussion. Here in Iceland, where the question has become not whether something needs to be done, but what to do, and freedom of expression is not a fetish, but one among crucial values, the questions have become, 1, how to define pornography. Here it is illegal, but there's no legal definition and no prosecutions. So it's essentially that law is a dead letter. And 2, how to effectively reach the pornographers technically, because most of the pornography here is being streamed in from elsewhere. You know, you kick the Americans off that military base, but you are still being occupied by this stuff. So think of it as the invasion of the sex bigots. As to the definitional question, to be effective and principled, a legal definition has to be limited to the pornography industry and to target its best documented and worst abuses. For this, pornography needs to be defined as what it is, that is, what the pornography industry makes. A form of violence against women that fits what all the research shows does the most harm. The sexually explicit materials combined with coercion, violence, degradation, and dehumanization, however you choose to capture that reality. This is the reality that defines it as a human rights violation. At this juncture, it's worthwhile to observe that Iceland, like most places, and in this I include the United States, which is actually something to say, has no doubt about the criminal status of child pornography, while adult pornography is often considered a form of freedom. There is something to the child-adult distinction, but it is also illusory on many levels. First, most women used to make pornography got into the sex industry, which is an arm of prostitution, as children. So you are not in pornography or in prostitution seeing two different groups of people in children and adults, but rather the same group of people at two different points in time, habituated to sexual abuse from childhood and traumatized by it into submission as adults. Secondly, because all pornography desensitizes its users, it needs to use ever more vulnerable people to break ever deeper social so-called taboos, to produce the sexual excitement and arousal that the consumer is looking for. This means using more and more children, more disabled women, etc. So adult women are made to look like children, which targets children among its consumers. Children are dressed up like adult women and used for sex accordingly. Third, both adult and child pornography are imposed on children, which produces the same traumatic response in them that imposing the acts in it when imposed on them produce. Both child and adult pornography are used to season children to sexual compliance. And finally, the pornography industry lies systematically about the ages of those they use to the authorities while communicating the actual age to the consumer in ways designed to evade those authorities. So you have, for example, magazines on top of which have huge letters that say 12. Underneath it in tiny letters, paren, all models over age 18, paren. All this means is that you can't do anything effective about child pornography so long as this massive industry of adult pornography is being allowed to exist. It is impossible to protect children without also addressing the harms of people who are 15 years and 366 days old. Age is definitely an inequality that produces vulnerability to exploitation. But as is recognized internationally and in the research on prostituted people, who are the population used to make most pornography, desperate poverty, destitution, right? Inability to feed your children, race, disadvantaged race in racist cultures, immigrant status, disability, and need I also say gender and transgender status, those too are inequalities that produce vulnerability to exploitation. Each one works in a distinct way, but actually in the pornography, they all work sexually through gender. Now, a country like Iceland has the Nordic model on prostitution. that recognizes that prostitution is a form of violence against women, perpetrated by pimps and driven by consumers. The way almost all pornography is made is by one man selling a woman or a child to another man with a camera to be used sexually, or by men using women or children online in live feed on the internet. What this means is that pornography is made through prostitution, precisely what the Nordic model prohibits doing. When you make pornography of someone, in other words, you make a prostitute out of them. In this light, prostitution is not a form of sexual freedom, and pornography is not either. Another definitional issue that wraps itself around this whole discussion is an even more illusory distinction. That is, the exception for artistic work. Many countries will standardly make a definition of pornography and then say, except when it's literary, artistic, scientific, etc., valuable in that way. And this includes Norway, for example. It makes some sense when pornography, however uselessly, is prohibited on a moral basis, as it is in the United States, where, by the way, the pornography industry has gone up about 100 times since this moral definition was instituted. And Norway, in part, uses an artistic exception and, in part, prohibits offensive materials. That's an example of a moral definition. The idea here is pornography is bad unless something about it makes it good. Now, when you are prohibiting pornography on the basis of human rights, it's an actual harm to human beings that you're talking about. That is, not on a moral basis, which people can validly differ about and is a matter of opinion, but on the basis of human rights. Human rights of human beings is not a subject for valid debate and discussion. It makes absolutely no sense at all if you're talking about real harm to real people. For example, so you have an artistic snuff movie, do you, with high production values. You are killing a woman for a pretty sex film, so it isn't pornography anymore. How about an artistic rape? Is that okay? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Why the value of the materials matters, and all the people who are used to make it, and the people who will then be mass violated in all the same ways by the people whose sexuality is being manipulated by enjoying using it, why those hurt people do not matter, but this thing that is said to be art does. That is the question raised by the artistic exception when we're thinking about looking at pornography for the harm to human rights that it actually does. Now, fundamentally, pornography is a technologically sophisticated form of trafficking in women and children. In Iceland, you already have the necessary legal structure and social understandings in place with CEDAW and the Palermo Protocol and prosecutions that have already been brought here successfully for sex trafficking, and your consultation recently on the subject of pornography. Pornographers are third parties who traffic women and children as and for sex to others for their sexual use. And in your case, although this is not essential, it is across international borders. Pornographers are sex traffickers by definition. With a law against pornography predicated on the way it works as a form of sex trafficking, implementing the standards prohibiting force, fraud, coercion, abuse of power, or position of vulnerability of the Palermo Protocol. You could reach at minimum the Icelandic technology based here that is trafficking a lot of it. Start with Vodafone, Siemens, Green Cloud, and all these fancy hotels. The trafficking concept also has the potential, although it is technically more challenging, to go after websites and hosts and IPs and servers extraterritorially, to reach out to those who are engaging in acts abroad that have harmful consequences here in Iceland, which is an alignment that your law already recognizes as legal in other areas. Because this is an international problem, ultimately, conceptually and jurisdictionally, it needs an international solution. But Iceland can be the foundation of that solution. Fundamentally, the Nordic model recognizes that prostitution is demand-driven. Pornography, I think, is primarily supply-driven. It is a business pushed on its consumers by the profit motive of its producers. As the research has found beyond any question, the more it is pushed on the consumer, the more of it he comes to want, the more aggressive and intrusive he needs it to be for it to work sexually. So there becomes more and more of it. It becomes more and more violent, with ever higher profits made from greater and greater risk of harm to the people in the consumer's environment. This has all happened already, and it is happening right now. It is toxic and dangerous to women's equality and safety. This is the intrinsic logic of pornography. What it means is that prostitution can be stopped by stopping the demand for it. But pornography needs to be stopped by cutting off the supply. So here's the point. Women can't be free without being equal. And pornography is keeping women unequal. I'm not saying pornography is all there is to inequality, but in capitalist, developed, media-saturated countries with 98% of the population on the internet, like Iceland, it is a force that has to be faced. Women cannot afford to ignore it, to act like it isn't there, like this isn't coming at us from all around us, in our workplaces, over our cell phones, everywhere. We can't ignore this anymore. So, against all the legal and social traditions that were laid down long before women were allowed a voice in politics, against everything constructed on our silence before we could even vote, now that women have been citizens for 100 years, now that we have been promised that our political equality will make our social equality possible, I want us to use it. Women, I think, have a right to be effective. Legislatively, you can stop the pornography as an engine and force for women's inequality. Together, you can stand up to these pimps and take back your bodies and your country and your sex equality and your sexual lives. My hope is that you will. Thank you.